Elijah Brooks, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, sat quietly at his desk near the window of Lincoln High School. The autumn breeze rustled the golden leaves outside, but inside, the room buzzed with the chatter of students settling into their seats. Unlike his classmates, who were busy talking and laughing, Elijah remained lost in thought, his sharp, hazel eyes fixed on the world beyond the glass. He wasn't uninterested in school, quite the opposite. Numbers fascinated him, formulas intrigued him, but the slow-paced, repetitive nature of his math class left him uninspired. Instead of answering questions or participating, he spent his time scribbling complex equations in the margins of his notebook, solving problems far beyond the curriculum. Despite his quiet nature, Elijah's mind worked like a machine, dissecting numbers and patterns effortlessly. However, his teachers rarely noticed him. To them, he was just another student, a daydreamer who never raised his hand. But Elijah didn't mind. He preferred to stay in the background, unnoticed. What he didn't know was that today would be different. Today, someone would finally notice his hidden brilliance, and his life would never be the same again. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a strict but highly respected math teacher at Lincoln High School, paced at the front of the classroom, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She had been teaching for over 2 decades and prided herself on her ability to push students to their full potential. However, today, frustration lingered in her expression. The results of the latest algebra test were sitting on her desk, and they were, to put it bluntly, disappointing. Students who had shown promise were struggling, and the overall performance of the class was below her expectations. She sighed, shaking her head, then started handing back the graded tests. Michael, 72. You need to review your formulas. Samantha, 85. Decent work, but I expect better. One by one, she distributed the papers, her comments ranging from neutral to disappointed. Then, she reached Elijah's desk. She hesitated for a moment, looking down at his test. A bold red 100% was circled at the top, flawless, without a single mistake. This wasn't the first time Elijah had aced an exam, but what irritated Mrs. Carter wasn't his score. It was his apparent lack of effort in class. He never raised his hand, never participated, and always seemed distant, as if he wasn't even paying attention. How could a boy who never engaged with the lesson be the best in the class? Handing Elijah his paper without a word, she pursed her lips and moved to the front of the room. "All right, listen up," she announced, her voice cutting through the low murmurs of students glancing at their scores. "Many of you did poorly on this test. We've been going over these concepts for weeks, yet some of you still struggle to grasp the fundamentals. If you don't master algebra now, you'll have a hard time in high school, let alone college or any real-world career." The room fell into an uneasy silence, students shifting in their seats. Elijah, as usual, was barely listening. He rested his chin on his hand, his gaze drawn to the golden leaves dancing outside the window. The wind carried them gently across the schoolyard, a far more engaging sight than another lecture on equations he already understood. Mrs. Carter noticed his distraction, and irritation flickered across her face. Enough was enough. "Elijah Brooks," she called sharply. Elijah jolted, his heart pounding as he heard his name. The room went completely silent as all eyes turned toward him. He swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise to his face. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured, barely audible. "You seem very interested in whatever's outside that window," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Perhaps you'd like to show the class just how much attention you've been paying." The students chuckled quietly, sensing that Elijah was about to be embarrassed. He stiffened in his seat, gripping his test paper tightly. "Come up here," Mrs. Carter ordered, nodding toward the whiteboard. Elijah's stomach twisted. He could feel the stares, the amused whispers of his classmates. Slowly, he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. The walk to the front of the class felt impossibly long, his legs heavy with every step. He had never been the center of attention before, and he didn't like it. Mrs. Carter picked up a marker and began writing a complex equation on the board. Unlike the simple algebra problems they had covered in class, this one was advanced, far beyond the level of an average high school student, let alone a freshman. She capped the marker, then turned to him with a challenging expression. "Go ahead," she said. "Solve it." Elijah stared at the equation, his mind racing. The numbers and variables blurred together for a moment, the pressure suffocating. His classmates whispered behind him, expecting him to fail. His palms grew sweaty, his breath uneven. He considered giving up, shaking his head and sitting back down. But then something inside him shifted. He had solved problems like this before, many times. This was just another puzzle, another challenge. And no matter how much his heart pounded, he knew one thing for certain. He could do this. Elijah took a deep breath, gripping the marker tightly. The classroom felt smaller, the air thick with anticipation. The equation in front of him looked intimidating, but deep down, he knew he had seen problems like this before, hidden in the margins of his notebook, scribbled during moments of boredom. This wasn't beyond him. It was within him. Behind him, whispers and quiet chuckles filled the air. "No way he's solving that," one student muttered. "She totally set him up." Another snickered. Elijah ignored them, his mind already breaking the equation apart. Step by step, he visualized the solution, seeing the patterns and simplifications that no one else in the room could. His heart was still racing, but a strange calmness settled over him. He was in his element now. He raised the marker and began to write. At first, his strokes were slow, hesitant, but as his confidence grew, his hand moved with certainty. He isolated variables, balanced both sides, and simplified expressions with precision. His movements became fluid, instinctive, as if the numbers spoke to him. The chuckles died down. The whispers faded. A hush spread across the room as the students leaned forward, their skepticism turning into curiosity. "Wait, is he actually solving it?" someone whispered. "Looks like it," another replied, their voice filled with disbelief. Elijah didn't stop. His mind worked quickly, each step leading seamlessly to the next. The equation that had once seemed impossible was now unraveling, its complexity breaking apart under his skill. He felt the weight of the class's attention on him, but instead of shrinking under it, he let it fuel him. Mrs. Carter, who had initially crossed her arms with a skeptical expression, now furrowed her brow, stepping closer to the board. She watched as Elijah's solution unfolded, her sharp eyes scanning his work. What she saw wasn't just correct, it was brilliant. The final step came faster than expected. Elijah paused for a brief second, double-checking his work. Then, with a steady hand, he wrote the final answer, circled it, and capped the marker. Silence. Elijah turned around slowly, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. He had done it. But the room was frozen, as if time had stopped. Then, a single clap. It came from the back of the room. A few others joined in, hesitant at first, then louder. Before he knew it, the entire class was applauding, Not mockingly, not sarcastically, but genuinely. Elijah's face burned, not from embarrassment, but from something new. Pride. Mrs. Carter studied the board one last time before turning to him, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. "This is correct," she said. The applause grew louder. Elijah stood in front of the class, his heart still pounding as the sound of applause filled the room. He had never been in this position before, at the center of attention with all eyes on him, not out of ridicule but out of respect. His classmates, who had once dismissed him as the quiet kid in the back, were now looking at him differently. Mrs. Carter, who had initially set up this challenge as a way to catch him off guard, was now staring at the whiteboard with a look of undeniable admiration. She stepped forward, her finger tracing the path of Elijah's solution. Her sharp eyes scanned each step, searching for any mistake, any miscalculation, but there were none. The logic was flawless. The execution was precise. Finally, she turned to him, her expression softer than before. "This," she said, gesturing to the board, "is what true understanding looks like." Elijah felt his chest tighten. He had spent years hiding his abilities, keeping his passion for math to himself, fearing that no one would understand, or worse, that they wouldn't care. But now, in this moment, he was being recognized for what he had always known deep down. Mrs. Carter addressed the class, her voice firm but filled with something different this time. Not frustration, but pride. "What you just witnessed wasn't luck," she said, looking around the room. "Elijah didn't just guess his way through this. He solved it step by step, with clarity, logic, and precision. This is what happens when someone truly understands the material." The class sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then a few students leaned forward, whispering amongst themselves. "That was insane," one murmured. "I didn't even understand half of what he did," another admitted. For the first time, Elijah saw something new in their faces: respect. Mrs. Carter turned back to him. "Elijah," she said, her voice gentler now, "why haven't you spoken up before? If you can do this, why do you sit in the back, so quiet?" Elijah hesitated, shifting on his feet. He had never been good at explaining himself. How could he put into words the fear of standing out, the comfort of staying invisible? He glanced down at his sneakers, then finally mumbled, "I didn't think anyone noticed." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Mrs. Carter's expression softened even more. "Well," she said, "it's time for that to change." Elijah wasn't sure what that meant, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the possibility. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back anymore. He was someone worth noticing. As the class slowly settled back into their routine, Elijah returned to his seat, gripping his notebook tighter than before. The weight of what had just happened settled over him like a heavy but not unwelcome presence. He had always known he was good at math, better than most, but he had never expected to be acknowledged for it, let alone applauded. His classmates, who had once barely noticed him, now cast curious glances in his direction, some whispering in hushed tones. A girl sitting one row ahead of him turned around, eyes wide with disbelief. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. Elijah hesitated. He didn't have an answer that would make sense to them. "I just figured it out," he said, shrugging slightly. Another student chimed in. "Dude, that was crazy. Are you like a genius or something?" Elijah felt his face heat up, and he shook his head quickly. "No, I just like math," he muttered. He wasn't used to this attention, and a part of him wanted to retreat to his usual quiet corner. But another part, the part that had stepped up to the whiteboard with confidence, felt something different. Pride. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, students began filing out, but not before a few stopped to pat Elijah on the back or throw a quick, "That was awesome," his way. He nodded awkwardly, clutching his notebook as if it were a lifeline. The recognition was new, unfamiliar, and a little overwhelming. Before he could leave, Mrs. Carter called his name again. "Elijah, can you stay for a moment?" He turned back, watching as the last few students left the room. The door shut behind them, leaving only him and Mrs. Carter in the now quiet classroom. She leaned against her desk, arms crossed, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Elijah," she began, her tone softer than he had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology." He blinked. Of all the things he expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. "An apology?" he echoed. Mrs. Carter nodded. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I like to think I know my students. But with you—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I misjudged you. I thought your silence meant you weren't interested. I assumed your lack of participation meant you didn't care. But I was wrong." Elijah shifted uncomfortably. He had never been one for deep conversations, especially not with teachers. "It's okay," he mumbled. "No, it's not," Mrs. Carter said firmly. "You have a gift, Elijah, and I don't want to see you hide it anymore." For the first time, Elijah felt seen, not just as a student, but as someone with potential. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to embrace it. That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table in his family's modest apartment, his notebook open in front of him. The events of the day replayed in his mind. The stares, the applause, the unexpected words from Mrs. Carter. He had always been content keeping his abilities to himself, but now, for the first time, someone was encouraging him to do more. His mother, a warm and kind-hearted woman, noticed his distracted expression as she set down a plate of food in front of him. "Elijah, honey, you've been quiet since you got home. Something on your mind?" she asked, sitting down beside him. He hesitated, unsure how to explain it. "Something happened in class today," he finally said. His father, a hard-working man who had always emphasized education, looked up from his newspaper. "Good or bad?" Elijah exhaled. "I guess, good. Mrs. Carter called me up to the board. She gave me a really hard problem to solve in front of everyone. At first, I thought she was trying to embarrass me." His mother's brow furrowed. "Did she?" He shook his head. "Number I solved it, and everyone saw." A slow smile spread across his father's face. "That's my boy," he said proudly. His mother reached over, squeezing his hand. "Elijah, we've always known you were special. I'm so glad others are starting to see it too." Elijah glanced down at his notebook, tracing the edges of the worn cover. "Mrs. Carter said she wants to help me. She mentioned some advanced math programs, competitions even. She thinks I should try." His parents exchanged a look before his mother spoke. "Do you want to?" That was the question, wasn't it? He had spent years keeping to himself, staying unnoticed. Stepping into something bigger felt terrifying, but also exciting. He thought about the moment at the whiteboard, the way the problem had clicked into place, the way the room had felt different afterward. "I don't know," he admitted. "What if I mess up?" His father chuckled. "Then you learn from it and try again." His mother nodded. "Elijah, you have a gift. but what you do with it is up to you. If this is something you want, we'll support you every step of the way." Elijah stared at the blank page of his notebook. For so long, it had been a place for secrets, problems he solved for himself, equations no one else saw. But now, it felt like something more, a space for possibilities. Slowly, he picked up his pencil and began to write. Not just numbers this time, but ideas, goals, dreams. For the first time, Elijah wasn't afraid of being seen. He was ready to step forward. The next day, as Elijah walked into his math class, something felt different. The usual chatter of students filled the room, but this time, when they saw him, they acknowledged him in a way they never had before. A few students nodded in his direction, others whispered to each other, and some even offered small smiles. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back anymore. He was someone they noticed. "Elijah, that was crazy yesterday," a boy from the back of the room called out. "How'd you even do that?" Elijah hesitated, his usual instinct to shy away from attention battling against the quiet pride he felt. "I just worked through it," he answered modestly, sliding into his usual seat by the window. "That wasn't just working through it," a girl added, leaning forward. "You made it look easy. You're like a math wizard or something." His cheeks flushed at the attention, but instead of retreating, he simply shrugged. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice soft but sincere. Even students who had never spoken to him before were now looking at him with curiosity. Some asked if he could help them with their homework. Others just wanted to understand how he thought. It was strange, this new attention. For the longest time, he had been comfortable in the background. But now, it didn't feel so bad to be seen. When Mrs. Carter entered the classroom, her usual brisk energy was accompanied by something else. A glance toward Elijah, this time with a trace of a smile. She began the lesson as usual, but when she called on Elijah to answer a question, her voice wasn't sharp or challenging. It was encouraging. Elijah hesitated for only a moment before answering, his explanation clear and confident. A few students murmured in quiet awe. Mrs. Carter nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent," she said warmly. "That's the kind of thinking we need to see more of." After class, Mrs. Carter asked Elijah to stay behind again. This time, the conversation wasn't about an apology. It was about an opportunity. "Elijah," she said, sitting on the edge of her desk, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about yesterday. You have an incredible gift, and I don't want it to go to waste." Elijah looked down at his notebook, unsure of what to say. "I don't really know what to do with it," he admitted. "That's where I can help," Mrs. Carter replied. "There's an advanced math program at the district level, a class for students like you who need more of a challenge. It meets after school twice a week, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Elijah's eyes widened. The idea was exciting but also intimidating. "Do you think I'd be good enough?" Mrs. Carter smiled. "I don't think, I know. This is a chance for you to explore your potential, to see how far you can go." Elijah took a deep breath. He thought about how the class had looked at him with admiration, how his parents had encouraged him, how, for the first time, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." The following week, Elijah attended his first advanced math class. As he stepped into the room, a familiar nervousness crept up his spine. The students here were different, focused, competitive, and eager to learn. They chatted in small groups, discussing problems he had never seen before. It was intimidating, but at the same time, exhilarating. The instructor introduced the day's lesson, diving straight into complex equations and theories. At first, Elijah hesitated, unsure if he truly belonged. But as the problems unfolded, something clicked. This was where he was meant to be. The pace was faster, the discussions more engaging, and for the first time, he felt challenged. Back at Lincoln High, Elijah's reputation grew. His classmates sought him out for help, not just in math, but because they respected him. The boy who had once faded into the background was now an inspiration. Mrs. Carter, too, changed. She looked at all her students differently now, searching for hidden potential instead of just outward participation. One evening, as Elijah sat at his kitchen table working on an advanced problem, his mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. Elijah smiled. "Me too." Elijah's journey reflects a universal truth. Hidden potential exists everywhere, often overlooked. Many people, especially students, feel unnoticed because they don't fit traditional expectations. But one moment of recognition, one opportunity, can change everything. Teachers, parents, and mentors play a crucial role in bringing out this potential. Like Mrs. Carter, educators must look beyond surface behavior and nurture hidden talents. Encouragement, rather than criticism, can inspire someone to step into their abilities. For those who feel unseen, your skills and passions matter. Whether it's math, music, writing, or something else, don't be afraid to embrace what makes you unique. Stepping out of the shadows is scary, but it's the first step toward growth. Elijah's story is a reminder. Brilliance isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back of the room, waiting for someone to notice. And when it's finally given the chance, it shines.